My name's Charlotte. I'm a second year LLB student and I am hoping to pursue human rights law after graduation and looking to go down the barrister route and qualify as a barrister in the UK. So I'm going to talk about the Zong massacre, which took place in 1781, and in particular the case that came from it going through the courts in 1783, which was the Gregson and Gilbert case. The Zong was the name of a ship that carried enslaved African people during the transatlantic slave trade. It was a British slave ship, as Britain were a notorious part of the slave trade, and when it set sail from Africa, headed for Jamaica in 1781, some navigational issues came up along the way in which the captain, Mr. Collingwood, mistakenly navigated the ship through some areas of no wind and low wind, which meant the ship ended up stranded for quite a while. So running out of key supplies like water and food and disease being rife on the boats meant that the crew started to panic. The captain came up with the idea of throwing some of the enslaved Africans overboard. When they reached Black River in Jamaica, they claimed on their insurance policy for the losses that they had faced. Even though this was done with malice and it was essentially murder. So the ship's crew were not prosecuted for murder. However, when they did go to their insurance policy holders, they refused, and that's how the case ended up in court. And it was held in the first instance court that the insurance company were liable in some cases for providing financial compensation for the effective murder of enslaved Africans. The insurance company then appealed the decision, which went to the King's Bench Division, and notably the Lord Chief Justice, the Earl of Mansfield, was on this case. Now he's significant because he served a pivotal role in an earlier case a few years ago concerning the slave trade, in which he decided in this case, which concerned the freedom of enslaved African, that this person could go free. And so this has been a point of legal debate on whether or not this was an early decision on English common law establishing that the slave trade was prohibited within English territory. So in this appeal decision, Lord Mansfield actually held that the insurance company should not pay, and that since they found that the crew were at fault and that there was malice and murder took place essentially, that they wouldn't be liable for paying on the policy. The public impact at the time was quite extensive. It was a controversial case in which different scholars and legal minds had their input. A freedman at the time, Alauda Equino, came to an anti-slavery corporation and wanted to get the crew prosecuted for murder, as he'd read about the case in the newspaper. Unfortunately, that was unsuccessful, but it did start many discussions, and obviously subsequently in 1787 we had the Slave Trade Act being enacted and then being further improved in 1794, and then 1807, which is the infamous piece of legislation that prohibited Britain from participating in the slave trade. So although to a modern audience today we understand that the events were extremely harrowing and gruesome, at the time slave owners and sailors and anyone who was part of that sort of naval crew was seen as very respectable members of society. There was often high-ranking individuals who took part in these voyages, so in terms of creating sort of controversial impact, that was unlikely, considering that, you know, a lot of these people on the ship were sort of lauded as respectable members of society. So this case was significant in terms of the journey to the abolition of the slave trade within the British Empire. It sort of started those discussions around the atrocities that were taking place on these voyages. In particular, one of the significant parts of this case was with reference to the general wording that was within these insurance policies. They would protect against general perils and losses, and that was soon eradicated and prohibited in law so that they could avoid the misuse and abuse of power. I think this story was particularly harrowing because you don't realise the extent to which there was malpractice and injustice going on. A lot of us are aware of, the horrific conditions that were taking place on board and how horrible the Middle Passage was, but the extent to which enslaved Africans were being mistreated, it's just, I didn't appreciate that that's sort of the extent to which it was taking place. These really were not viewed as human lives or as people. The slave owners just viewed people as cargo and, maybe even livestock, but definitely not as humans.